Trump threatened Iran again while J.D. Vance was trying to sell the world a story of progress in Switzerland. On television, that looks like chaos. One man talks peace, another man threatens strikes, Iran fires back, and the headlines explode. But look closer. The question is not whether Washington looked divided. The question is whether that division was itself the weapon. Look at the timing. Vance was at Bergenstock, Switzerland, in a high-level meeting with Iranian officials, with Qatar and Pakistan acting as mediators. The public message was diplomatic. There was talk of progress, technical talks, and even a possible roadmap toward a final deal within 60 days. Then Trump entered the room without entering the room. Trump warned that if Iran did not restrain Hezbollah and its allies, or if Iran tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, the United States could resume attacks. That threat landed right in the middle of Vance's diplomatic choreography. It did not merely interrupt the talks. It changed the temperature of the room. Here is the part they do not want to explain. The negotiations did not collapse. Iran reacted angrily. Iranian officials warned Washington to be careful. Tehran insisted on its right to uranium enrichment and tied further progress to Lebanon. But the talks continued. Technical discussions were still scheduled. The mediators still had work to do. That is not a coincidence. If Trump's threat had truly destroyed the process, you would have seen walkouts, canceled technical meetings, and public rupture. Instead, you saw something more dangerous, pressure and negotiation moving together. Not peace replacing coercion. Not coercion replacing peace. Both at the same time, like two blades closing around the same piece of metal. So the public debate is asking the wrong question. It asks, did Trump sabotage Vance? But the real question is sharper. Was Vance offering Iran the door while Trump reminded Iran what happens if it refuses to walk through it? This is where the official story begins to crack. We are told diplomacy is a room of calm voices and careful words. But in real geopolitics, diplomacy is often a room where everyone hears the sound of artillery outside the window. The polite sentence is only half the message. The other half is what moves behind it. I want you to hold one image in your mind. A conference room in Switzerland, quiet, clean, controlled. Across the table, officials discuss ceasefires, nuclear limits, oil sanctions, safe passage, and technical channels. But under that polished table sits the Strait of Hormuz, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israeli strikes, oil prices, and the memory of American force. That is the real table, not the one in the photographs, the table underneath it. The model I would use here is simple. I call it the two-voice trap. One voice says there is still a path. The other voice says the path has walls, and the walls can crush you. If you only listen to one voice, you misunderstand the strategy. The power is in the combination. Vance's job was to make agreement appear possible. Trump's job, whether disciplined or impulsive, was to make refusal feel expensive. Iran's job was to prove that it still had enough leverage to demand a price. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz suddenly became more than a waterway. It became a pressure gauge. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow passage of water. It is a global artery. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has said roughly 20 million barrels per day of oil move through that choke point in 2024, about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. When that artery tightens, the whole body feels it. Iran claimed the strait was closed. The United States disputed that. On the surface, that sounds like a factual argument, closed or not closed, but that is too shallow. The deeper fact is that shipping behavior changed. Reuters reported that only 5 vessels passed through on one Sunday, down from 26 the day before. Now pause there. If a bank says there is no panic but everyone is pulling out cash, do you believe the slogan or the line outside the door? Hormuz did not have to become completely sealed to become strategically useful. It only had to become uncertain. Uncertainty is a weapon. Not as loud as a missile. Not as visible as a warship. But for oil markets, insurers, shippers, and governments, uncertainty is a tax on every decision. Every captain hesitates. Every trader recalculates. Every finance ministry watches the price of fuel like a heartbeat on a hospital screen. That is why Iran's Hormuz move was both strong and risky. Strong because it reminded the world that Tehran can touch the global economy without firing directly at Washington. Risky because once Iran makes the threat visible, the United States can frame itself as the defender of open trade, stable energy, and safe passage. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Brent crude reportedly climbed as high as $82.30 after the threats, and Hormuz claims shook the market, then later fell to around $78.80 when talks appeared to conclude with progress. That swing tells you something powerful. The market was not simply pricing war. It was pricing the credibility of diplomacy. This is why the Switzerland talks mattered. Not because one meeting could solve Iran's nuclear program, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Hormuz, oil sanctions, and Israeli security all at once. It could not. The talks mattered because they created a temporary structure where all those pressures could be traded, sequenced, delayed, or weaponized. Reuters reported a possible 60-day roadmap toward a final agreement. That number matters. 60 days is not peace. 60 days is a fuse. It gives negotiators time, but it also creates a deadline. Every party can now ask the same question. What can we gain before the fuse reaches the end? For Washington, 60 days can mean controlled pressure. Keep Iran at the table. Keep oil prices from exploding. Keep Israel from escalating too far in Lebanon. Keep domestic critics from saying Trump and Vance are giving Iran a new version of an old nuclear deal. For Iran, 60 days can mean breathing space, a chance to pursue oil waivers, petrochemical relief, frozen asset access, and reconstruction support, while refusing to publicly surrender the right to enrich uranium. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of a state. Iran wants that belt loosened. But Iran cannot simply look desperate for relief. That would be politically dangerous at home and strategically dangerous abroad. So Tehran has to talk like a state that can still hurt the system. It points to Hormuz, it points to Lebanon, it points to Hezbollah, it points to uranium enrichment. It says if you want calm, you must pay for calm. That is the machinery under the drama. Trump's threat did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived when Iran was trying to connect several theaters into one negotiation. Lebanon was no longer just Lebanon. Hormuz was no longer just Hormuz. Uranium was no longer just uranium. Every file became a lever tied to another lever. And Lebanon may be the most misunderstood part of this entire story. The public hears U.S.-Iran nuclear talks and assumes the center is uranium. But Iran reportedly argued that Washington had not fulfilled commitments related to Lebanon. Tehran used Lebanon as a gate. Before deeper nuclear movement, it wanted the regional battlefield addressed. That changes everything, because if Lebanon becomes the key to the nuclear room, then the nuclear deal is no longer only between Washington and Tehran. It becomes indirectly tied to Israel, Hezbollah, Lebanese civilian ceasefire arrangements, and the ability of outside powers to control actors who do not always move neatly on command. An alliance is not a family photo. It is a room full of countries pretending not to count the knives. Washington may want a diplomatic track with Iran. Israel may want freedom to strike threats in Lebanon. Iran may want Hezbollah preserved as deterrence. Hezbollah may have its own calculations. Lebanon pays the human cost. That is why the official language sounds cleaner than the reality. You hear technical talks, you hear roadmap, you hear progress. But underneath those words are displaced families, damaged towns, airstrikes, retaliatory threats, oil tankers, sanctions lawyers, and intelligence officers trying to guess whether the next statement is theater or signal. The question is not what they said. The question is what they moved. Did ships move through Hormuz? Did technical teams keep meeting? Did oil prices calm or spike? Did Israel reduce operations in Lebanon? Did Iran permit inspectors back into sensitive nuclear sites? Did Washington confirm sanctions waivers? Or did Tehran merely claim them? This is the discipline we need. Do not let headlines hypnotize you. A headline says total chaos, but states often use chaos the way a magician uses smoke. The smoke is real, it burns the eyes, but the trick is happening somewhere else. Trump's public threat gave American hardliners something to hear. It said we are not weak. Vance's diplomatic language gave negotiators something to use. It said there is still a path. Iran's Hormuz claim gave Tehran something to sell domestically. It said, we are not begging. Each side was speaking to multiple audiences at once. That is why the same event can look irrational on cable news and disciplined on the geopolitical board. Public politics rewards clean contradictions. Strategy thrives inside messy contradictions. A leader can threaten and negotiate. A state can deny escalation while preparing for it. A mediator can praise progress while the battlefield still smolders. Now here is the strongest argument against this analysis. Maybe there was no coordinated strategy. Maybe Trump simply undercut Vance. Maybe this was not a two-voice trap, but a one-man disruption. Maybe the threat made Iran harder to handle, embarrassed U.S. negotiators, and gave Tehran an excuse to raise demands. That argument deserves respect. Smart people can believe it because Trump's public style often blurs signal and impulse. A threat posted or delivered at the wrong moment can damage trust. Iranian officials could use it to say Washington cannot negotiate in good faith. Mediators could find themselves repairing damage instead of advancing substance. And there is evidence that the threat shook the atmosphere. AP described the talks as continuing only after Trump shook them with threats. Iranian officials responded sharply. The Guardian framed the moment as Trump threatening Iran after Vance hailed progress. So yes, the disruption was real. We should not pretend it was elegant. But the counter-argument cannot explain the full pattern. If the threat was purely destructive, why did technical talks continue? Why did mediators keep the process alive? Why did the market later respond to signs of progress? Why did the reported 60-day roadmap survive long enough to be discussed publicly? That does not prove perfect coordination, it proves something subtler. Even if Trump's threat was partly impulsive, the system absorbed it and converted it into pressure. In geopolitics, intent matters, but effects matter more. A reckless spark can still become useful if everyone else is already standing around a furnace. This is where Iran's own strategy becomes dangerous for Iran. By tying Hormuz to Lebanon and Lebanon to nuclear concessions, Tehran increased its leverage. But it also gave Washington a cleaner story to tell. Iran is threatening global commerce to protect regional proxies. That story is powerful, especially when energy markets are nervous. Iran's leverage works only if the world fears disruption more than it blames Tehran for causing it. That is a narrow bridge. If Tehran looks like it is defending itself, it gains sympathy in parts of the world. If it looks like it is holding the global oil system hostage, it invites pressure from countries that otherwise dislike American force. This is the Hormuz paradox. The more Iran proves it can endanger the artery, the more other powers have reason to keep a hand on Iran's wrist. A choke point is a weapon only until everyone agrees that your hand is too close to the throat. Washington understands that. That is why safe passage became part of the conversation. A communication channel for commercial ships may sound technical, almost boring, but boring details are often where the real deal hides. A safe passage mechanism is not just maritime housekeeping. It is a test of command, credibility, and restraint. If Iran can help keep ships moving, Tehran proves it can control escalation. If it cannot, then either Iran overplayed its authority or the region is more fragmented than negotiators admit. Both outcomes matter. The world does not only ask whether Iran wants a deal, it asks whether Iran can enforce the conditions that make a deal useful. The same applies to Lebanon. If Washington cannot influence Israel's actions, Iran will argue that American promises are empty. If Tehran cannot restrain Hezbollah, Washington will argue that Iranian promises are empty. Each side is not merely negotiating with the other. Each side is proving whether it can control its own side of the battlefield. That is the hidden crisis inside the public crisis. The talks are not only about concessions, they are about command. Who can command allies? Who can command proxies? Who can command markets? Who can command their own political base? A state that cannot command its network cannot sell a durable deal. Now look again at Vance. His role was not simply to be the peaceful face. His role was to make the deal imaginable without making it look soft. That is hard, especially when critics can say any relief for Iran resembles the old nuclear bargain that many conservatives spent years attacking. So Vance needed progress, but not surrender. Trump gave him cover, but at a cost. The threat told domestic critics that pressure remained alive. But it also made Tehran question whether any promise from the room could survive the next public blast. This is the knife edge of coercive diplomacy. Pressure can bring a state to the table, but too much pressure can make the table look like a trap. Iran faces its own knife edge. It wants sanctions relief and economic breathing room. But it cannot allow the image that American threats forced it to kneel. So Iranian officials responded with defiance. They defended enrichment. They tied the talks to Lebanon. They signaled that Hormuz remained in the picture. The posture was not random. Here is the part they do not want to explain. Everyone in this story needs the talks to continue, but no one wants to look like they need the talks to continue. That is why the rhetoric is so violent and the process so stubborn. The words scream rupture. The schedule whispers survival. The oil market heard the whisper. That is why price action matters. A military analyst may focus on threats, a diplomat may focus on statements, but a trader looks at probabilities. When Brent fell after signs of progress, the market was not declaring peace. It was saying the immediate risk of uncontrolled rupture had decreased. That can change fast, very fast. Hormuz can turn a sentence into a price spike before governments finish drafting their statements. Lebanon can turn a ceasefire into a blame game before mediators finish their next call. A single strike, a single ship incident, a single inspection dispute could turn the 60-day roadmap into paper ash. So what should you watch now? Not the loudest sentence, not the angriest post. Watch the physical indicators. Watch whether ships continue moving through Hormuz in numbers closer to normal. If traffic stays depressed, the crisis is not over, even if officials smile for cameras. Watch whether the technical talks actually produce language on uranium enrichment, inspectors, oil waivers, and frozen assets. Iran has claimed economic concessions, but unless Washington confirms the scope, that claim remains politically useful but not fully verified. The details will decide whether this was progress or packaging. And watch Lebanon. Specifically, watch whether Israeli operations decline, whether Hezbollah restraint holds, and whether Iran stops using Lebanon as the excuse to delay nuclear movement. If Lebanon remains hot, the nuclear room stays filled with smoke. No negotiator can see clearly in a room filled with smoke. Those are the three signals for the next 48 to 72 hours. Hormuz traffic, technical language, and Lebanon restraint. Not speeches, signals. Because speeches are costumes. Movements are fingerprints. The deeper lesson is uncomfortable. We like to imagine peace as the opposite of threats. But in this crisis, peace and threats are braided together. The offer and the warning came as a pair. Vance held out the possibility of a new page. Trump reminded Iran that the old page could still be burned. That does not make the strategy safe. It makes it volatile. A two-voice trap can corner an adversary, but it can also confuse allies, empower hardliners, and make miscalculation easier. When everyone is pretending to control chaos, one actor only has to misread the script for chaos to become real. And that is why this moment matters. Not because Trump spoke loudly, not because Vance smiled carefully, not because Iran shouted back. It matters because the machinery of a possible deal is now running beside the machinery of a possible escalation. They are not separate tracks. They are crossing tracks. If the roadmap survives, Washington will claim pressure worked. Iran will claim resistance won concessions. Mediators will claim diplomacy prevented war. Markets will breathe. But if the roadmap breaks, each side will point to the same facts and say the other side was never serious. That is the trap of negotiated coercion. Success and failure use the same evidence until the final moment. A threat can be called leverage if a deal follows. The same threat can be called sabotage if the talks collapse. History often does not judge the method. It judges the outcome, then rewrites the method to fit. So when you hear total chaos, do not stop there. Chaos may be the surface. Underneath it is a contest over command, credibility, oil, proxies, enrichment, and political survival. The stage is Switzerland. The fuse is 60 days. The pressure points are Hormuz and Lebanon. The audience is the world economy. On a mine. And the question that remains is not whether leaders want peace. Every leader says that when the cameras are on. The question is far darker. When peace only becomes possible because everyone is afraid of the alternative, are we watching diplomacy succeed or watching war learn how to speak more politely?